The blazing dawn painted the Colorado sky as Eliza Forrester clutched her family heirloom locket, her knuckles white with determination. The wagon train heading to Fort Garland wouldn't wait for stragglers, and at 22, she had already learned that life on the frontier showed no mercy to those who hesitated. The year was 1876, and the promise of a new beginning pulled Eliza westward like an invisible thread. Her parents' death from influenza 6 months prior had left her with nothing but debts and painful memories in St. Louis. Her aunt's letter offering a teaching position at the newly established school in Fort Garland had been a lifeline, and Eliza had sold everything she owned to purchase passage on the wagon train. "Miss Forrester will be stopping ahead for water," called Mr. Daniels, the wagon master. "Not for long, mind you. Need to make Fort Garland before nightfall tomorrow if the weather holds." Eliza nodded, grateful for the brief respite. The wooden bench of the wagon had become increasingly uncomfortable over the past 3 weeks of travel. Her traveling companions, the elderly widow Patterson and her quiet granddaughter Ruby, had been kind enough, but Eliza longed for privacy and space to breathe. "You'll find your place in Fort Garland, dear," Widow Patterson said, noticing Eliza's distant expression. "The West has a way of making a person new." "I hope so," Eliza replied, smoothing her dusty blue traveling dress. "Teaching has always been my calling, even if St. Louis society deemed it barely respectable for a woman of my standing." The wagon train followed the winding trail through the foothills, the towering Rocky Mountains a constant presence on the horizon. When they stopped by a creek for water, Eliza stretched her legs, wandering a short distance to gather wildflowers that grew in surprising abundance among the rocks. That's when she first saw him. Colton Kincaid sat astride his chestnut stallion on a ridge above the creek, observing the wagon train with the watchful eyes of someone who had learned to anticipate trouble before it arrived. At 30, he'd spent more than half his life in the saddle, first as an Army scout during the war, then as a ranch foreman, and now as the owner of the modest but growing Kincaid Ranch outside Fort Garland. He hadn't planned to investigate the wagon train. His business in town selling 3 prime horses to the Army outpost had been completed efficiently. But something about the distant procession had drawn him to take a closer look on his way home, his gaze fixed on a slender woman in blue gathering wildflowers at the creek's edge. Something about her careful movements and the way she paused to look up at the mountains struck him. She didn't move like someone born to frontier life, yet there was a quiet determination in her posture that spoke of inner strength. Colton nudged his horse down the slope, intending to offer assistance to the wagon master as a courtesy. He'd made the journey between Fort Garland and the mountain trails enough times to know the dangerous stretches that lay ahead. "Afternoon," he called as he approached the creek. "Wagon train to Fort Garland," Mr. Daniels looked up from watering his horses. "That's right, you from there, mister," Colton Kincaid, "got a ranch 10 miles north of town." He dismounted, leading his horse to drink. "You've got about 4 hours of daylight left. I'd suggest making camp at Widow's Creek tonight. The trail gets narrow beyond that point, not something you want to navigate in the dark." As they spoke, Eliza returned with her modest bouquet of wildflowers. She nodded politely at the stranger, noting his weathered hat and the confidence with which he carried himself. Unlike the dandies who had pursued her in St. Louis, there was nothing artificial about this man. His face was tanned from years under the western sun, and his eyes, a startling shade of gray, assessed everything with quick intelligence. "Miss Forrester," Mr. Daniels called. "This here's Mr. Kincaid from Fort Garland, says we should make camp at some creek ahead." "Widow's Creek," Colton corrected, tipping his hat to Eliza. "Miss Forrester." "Mr. Kincaid," she acknowledged with a slight curtsy, a habit from her Eastern upbringing that seemed suddenly out of place. "Are you acquainted with Mrs. Helen Summers?" "She's my aunt and the reason I'm traveling to Fort Garland." Recognition flickered across Colton's face. "The schoolteacher?" "Yes, madam, finest baker in 3 counties, and she's had every eligible bachelor in town over for Sunday supper at some point." A smile softened his weathered features. though I suspect her efforts at matchmaking haven't been as successful as her apple pie. Eliza couldn't help but laugh, the sound carrying across the creek. That sounds like Aunt Helen. She wrote that the town needed a second teacher for the younger children, and she's right about that. Fort Garland's growing fast since the railroad spur came through last year. Colton hesitated, then added, "Town will be glad to have you, Miss Forrester." There was something in his direct gaze that made Eliza feel as though he could see past her carefully maintained composure to the uncertainty beneath. She looked away first, busying herself with securing her flowers. "I'd better return to the wagon," she said. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Kincaid. Likewise, Miss Forrester." He turned back to Mr. Daniels. "I'll ride with you to Widow's Creek if you don't mind the company. That stretch has had some trouble with bandits lately." The wagon master nodded gratefully, and Colton mounted his horse once more, falling in alongside the lead wagon as they resumed their journey. Throughout the afternoon, Eliza found herself watching the tall cowboy who rode alongside their caravan. There was an easy competence in everything he did, the way he scanned the horizon, how he communicated with the wagon master, the gentle handling of his horse. When they made camp that evening, he helped establish the perimeter, showed two young boys how to set snares for rabbits, and still found time to assist Widow Patterson with her cooking fire. "That Mr. Kincaid seems a fine gentleman," the widow observed as Eliza helped her prepare a simple stew. "Not many ranch owners would take time to escort strangers." "I suppose frontier life requires people to look out for one another," Eliza replied, though she too had been impressed by his quiet kindness. After supper, as families gathered around campfires and the night watch was established, Colton approached Eliza where she sat mending a tear in her shawl. "Mind if I join you, Miss Forrester?" he asked, removing his hat. "Please do," she replied, setting aside her needlework. He settled onto a nearby log, his long legs stretched before him. "Your aunt mentioned you were coming last time I was in town. She's been fixing up the room behind her house for weeks now. I hope I don't disappoint her expectations," Eliza said softly. "Teaching in Fort Garland will be quite different from my experience in St. Louis." "How so?" "In St. Louis, I taught the daughters of wealthy merchants and bankers. Here," she gestured to the wilderness surrounding them, "the children will have different needs, different experiences." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "The children around Fort Garland are hungry to learn, though. Some ride 5 miles each way to attend school. They might not have fancy book learning, but they know things city children don't: how to track animals, predict weather from cloud patterns, survive winters that would freeze the life out of most Easterners." "You speak as though from experience, Mr. Kincaid." A shadow crossed his face. "Came west with my family when I was 10, lost them to mountain fever the first winter. An old trapper took me in, taught me what I needed to know to survive." His voice held no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact acceptance. "The West can be hard, Miss Forrester, but it rewards those who learn its ways." "And have you found your reward?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed so at ease in a world that still felt foreign to her. He looked toward his ranch in the distance, invisible in the darkness but clearly mapped in his mind. "Getting there. Started with 20 acres and 3 horses 7 years ago. Now I've got 200 acres and 40 horses. Another couple years I might actually turn a profit." The corner of his mouth lifted in a half smile. Their conversation continued as the camp quieted around them. Eliza found herself sharing stories of her life in St. Louis, her parents' passing, her dreams of making a difference through teaching. Colton listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights about her new home that both excited and intimidated her. "Fort Garland isn't St. Louis," he acknowledged when she expressed concern about the isolation, "but there's a community there, folks who look out for each other. And the land." He gestured to the star-filled sky above them. "It gets in your blood after a while." When Eliza finally retired to her wagon, she found herself more eager than fearful about the day ahead. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. The wagon train set out early, with Colton continuing to ride alongside. He pointed out landmarks to Eliza when their paths crossed a distant peak named for a Spanish explorer, a valley where wild horses still roamed, the first glimpse of Fort Garland nestled in the distance. They were perhaps 3 hours from town when disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind caught a cooking ember from the Hendersons' poorly extinguished breakfast fire, carrying it to their wagon's canvas cover. The dry material, baked for weeks under the western sun, ignited instantly. Eliza had been riding in the Hendersons' wagon that morning, giving Widow Patterson some privacy to tend to her ailing granddaughter. Mrs. Henderson and her husband had walked ahead with their 3 sons, leaving Eliza alone in the wagon with their sleeping infant daughter. She noticed the smoke too late. By the time she called out, flames had engulfed the back half of the canvas cover. The wagon lurched as the terrified horses tried to bolt, held in check only by the brake that Mr. Henderson had wisely set. "Fire!" Eliza screamed, gathering the baby in her arms. She moved toward the front of the wagon, but a burning section of canvas collapsed, blocking her escape. Choking smoke filled the enclosed space as the flames spread rapidly to the wooden frame and the family's possessions. Outside, chaos erupted. Mr. Daniels and the other men rushed toward the burning wagon, but the heat pushed them back. Mrs. Henderson's screams for her baby pierced the air. Colton had been riding ahead, scouting the trail when he heard the commotion. He wheeled his horse around and galloped back, taking in the situation with one glance. The wagon was now fully engulfed, the wooden sides catching fire as the canvas burned away. "Eliza's in there with the baby," Mrs. Henderson sobbed, struggling against her husband's restraining arms. Without hesitation, Colton spurred his horse forward. He circled the wagon once, looking for the safest approach, then dismounted and grabbed a water-soaked blanket from a bystander. "Cover your head and the baby," he shouted toward the wagon. "I'm coming in." Inside, Eliza had retreated to the corner furthest from the flames, shielding the infant with her body. The heat was unbearable, the smoke making it nearly impossible to breathe. She heard Colton's shout and pulled her shawl over the baby's face. "Here," she called back, her voice breaking. Wrapping the wet blanket around his shoulders and head, Colton charged through the wall of flames at the front of the wagon. The fire seared his exposed skin, but he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that seconds mattered. Through the smoke, he saw Eliza crouched in the corner, her dress smoldering at the hem, her face streaked with soot. Their eyes met across the burning wagon, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a connection forged in crisis. "Give me the baby," he ordered, his voice rough from smoke. Eliza handed over the infant, who was miraculously still sleeping, protected from the worst of the smoke by Eliza's careful shielding. Colton tucked the child securely against his chest, then reached for Eliza with his free arm. "We jump on 3, he said, pulling her close. 1, 2, 3, they leaped from the back of the wagon just as the wooden floor gave way. Colton twisted in midair, taking the brunt of the fall on his shoulder while protecting both Eliza and the baby. They rolled away from the burning wreckage as men rushed forward with water buckets, attempting to prevent the fire from spreading to other wagons. Mrs. Henderson fell upon them, snatching her baby with tearful gratitude. The infant, disturbed by the commotion, began to wail the most welcome sound to everyone's ears. Eliza remained on the ground, coughing violently as her lungs tried to expel the smoke. Colton knelt beside her, his own breathing labored, his right hand and forearm angry with burns. "You're hurt," she managed between coughs, reaching for his injured arm. "It's nothing," he replied, though his clenched jaw betrayed his pain. "Are you burned?" She shook her head, then noticed the singed edges of her dress. "Nothing serious, Mr. Kincaid. Colton, thank you." His given name felt right on her lips, especially after what they'd just endured together. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "You need water and rest," he said, leading her toward the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree. The wagon was a total loss, despite the frantic efforts to douse the flames. The Hendersons' possessions were destroyed, but Mr. Daniels quickly organized the other families to share space and supplies. No one complained, all were simply grateful that no lives had been lost. The town doctor, who had been traveling with the wagon train to take up practice in Fort Garland, insisted on treating Colton's burns. Eliza sat nearby, sipping water and watching as the physician applied salve to the angry red skin. "You're lucky," the doctor pronounced. Another few seconds in that inferno would have done permanent damage. As it is, you'll have some scarring, but you'll keep full use of your hand. Colton nodded stoically, his eyes finding Eliza's across the short distance. "Worth it," he said simply. They reached Fort Garland by late afternoon, the entire town turning out to welcome the wagon train and assist the Hendersons, whose plight had been sent ahead by a rider Colton had dispatched. Eliza found herself swept into her aunt's embrace, the older woman's relief palpable. "When I heard about the fire," Helen Summers couldn't finish the sentence, pulling back to examine her niece for injuries. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't," Eliza said gently. "Thanks to Mr. Kincaid." Her aunt's expression softened as she looked over at Colton, who was speaking with the fort's commander about the Hendersons' situation. "That man, I should have known he'd be in the thick of any heroics. Been trying to get him to Sunday dinner for years, but he's always too busy with that ranch of his. Perhaps he'll accept an invitation now," Eliza suggested, surprising herself with the hope behind the words. Over the next weeks, Eliza settled into life in Fort Garland. The town was smaller than she had imagined, but vibrant with the energy of a place finding its identity. The school, a simple one-room building at the edge of town, welcomed her warmly, and she found joy in teaching the frontier children, whose eagerness to learn matched Colton's description. Colton visited town regularly, always finding reason to stop by the school or her aunt's house. His burns healed slowly, leaving scars across his right hand that he dismissed as badges of honor when Eliza expressed concern. Their friendship deepened with each encounter. He showed her the beauty of the mountains, teaching her to ride properly and introducing her to the sweeping vistas that had captured his heart years before. She shared her books with him, reading aloud by lamplight on her aunt's porch while he listened, occasionally asking questions that revealed his quick intelligence and curiosity. Helen watched their growing attachment with satisfaction, but maintained a discreet silence, allowing their relationship to unfold at its own pace. 3 months after Eliza's arrival, Colton invited her to visit his ranch. Helen raised an eyebrow but agreed to chaperone, her presence both proper and unobtrusive as Colton proudly showed Eliza the home he had built with his own hands. "It's not much compared to St. Louis mansions," he acknowledged as they stood on the porch of the sturdy log house. "But there's room to expand. It's wonderful," Eliza replied honestly, admiring the craftsmanship and the way the house seemed to belong to the landscape. "You've created something remarkable here." His gray eyes warmed at her praise. "There's something I've been meaning to show you," he said, leading her toward the corral where several horses grazed peacefully. A beautiful Palomino mare lifted her head as they approached. "This is Sunrise," Colton said, whistling softly. The horse trotted over immediately. "I've been training her for you." Eliza looked at him in surprise. "For me, a schoolteacher needs reliable transportation," he explained, though the gift clearly meant more than mere practicality, especially one who might want to visit a certain ranch more often. The implication behind his words made Eliza's heart beat faster. She reached out to stroke the mare's velvety nose, buying time to compose herself. "She's beautiful, Colton, but I couldn't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you will. Consider her payment for reading lessons." Eliza laughed. "You hardly need reading lessons." "No," he agreed, his expression growing serious, "but I find I need other things I never thought I would." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "What happened in that burning wagon?" Eliza finally said. "I never properly thanked you." "You don't need to thank me for that." "Not for saving me," she clarified. "For showing me what courage looks like. I came west thinking I was being brave, starting a new life." "But true courage is what you did facing danger without hesitation to help others." Colton shook his head. "That wasn't courage, Eliza, that was necessity, the thought of losing you before I'd even had the chance to know you." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "I'm not a man of fancy words, but I know what I want, and ever since that day, all I've wanted is to be near you." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "I feel the same way," she admitted. Every day that I don't see you feels incomplete somehow." He took her hand, his scarred fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm asking for more than friendship, Eliza. I know it's soon, and I know Fort Garland isn't the life you planned, but plans change," she interrupted softly. "People change." The woman who left St. Louis wouldn't have understood what I feel now, but she never rode through flames to save a child, either. A slow smile spread across Colton's face. "And what do you feel now?" Instead of answering with words, Eliza rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Colton pulled her closer, his arms strong and secure around her waist. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eliza Forrester. Have since I pulled you from that wagon and probably before, if I'm honest with myself." "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural, "though I suspect my aunt will be insufferable about her matchmaking success." Colton laughed, the sound rich and free. "She can claim all the credit she wants as long as you agree to be my wife." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Kincaid?" "It is indeed, Miss Forrester, though I should probably do it properly." He stepped back and dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Eliza, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here, teach our children to read and ride, grow old with me on this land that's become my heart's home?" Tears of happiness blurred Eliza's vision. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." Helen, who had been discreetly examining the vegetable garden some distance away, pretended surprise when they approached hand in hand to share their news. Her delighted reaction was genuine, however, as was her immediate insistence on hosting the wedding at her home in town. The next few months passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Eliza continued teaching, while Colton divided his time between ranch work and adding 2 rooms to his house, a larger kitchen and a proper study where Eliza could continue tutoring during the summer months. They were married on a perfect autumn day, with golden aspens framing the mountains beyond Fort Garland. The entire town turned out for the celebration, including the Hendersons with their infant daughter, now named Eliza Colleen in honor of the 2 people who had saved her life. "Never seen Kincaid smile so much," remarked Mr. Daniels to Helen as they watched the couple's first dance. "Man's been a loner since I've known him. Sometimes it takes finding the right person to realize you've been incomplete," Helen replied wisely. "And sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal what truly matters." Across the room, Colton held Eliza close as they danced, her white dress swirling around their feet. The scar on his hand stood out against the fabric of her waist, a permanent reminder of the day that had brought them together. "Happy, Mrs. Kincaid," he murmured against her ear. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "Though I still think we should have taken Aunt Helen up on her offer to live in town for the winter. Your ranch is rather isolated when the snow comes." Colton's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Are you saying you're afraid you'll get tired of just my company for days on end?" "Never," she assured him, brushing her fingers across his cheek. "I just worry about my students." "Your aunt has agreed to handle the school during the worst weather," he reminded her. "And I've arranged for Tom Jenkins to check on us if we don't make it to town for more than a week." Eliza nodded, though a hint of concern lingered in her eyes. Colton noticed, as he always did. "You're still worried about something," he observed. "What is it, love?" She hesitated, then admitted, "What if there's an emergency, a fire, or understanding dawned in his expression. "You're still thinking about the wagon." "Sometimes I dream about it," she confessed. "The heat, the smoke, not being able to breathe." Colton led her away from the dancing, finding a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "Listen to me, Eliza. I've lived through blizzards, droughts, and everything in between out at that ranch. The house is solid, with firefighting equipment in every room. We have 3 wells, extra supplies, and neighbors who will ride through anything to help if needed." He took both her hands in his. "I would never risk your safety, you know that, don't you?" Looking into his steady gray eyes, Eliza felt her anxiety ease. "I do know that, and I'm not afraid, not really. It's just adjusting to how different everything is here. Different, yes, but not without its own kind of security." He smiled reassuringly. Besides, I have plans for that ranch that require many years and many hands to complete, our hands and eventually, God willing, our children's. The mention of children brought a blush to Eliza's cheeks and a softening to her expression. I like the sound of that, she said quietly. Their honeymoon was a brief journey to Denver, where Colton had business with horse buyers and Eliza delighted in the modest opera house and bookstores. They returned to Fort Garland as the first snow dusted the mountains. Ready to begin their life together at the ranch, Colton had renamed Sunrise, after the Palomino mare that had been his first gift to Eliza. Winter came early and harsh that year, but the Kincaid home remained warm and bright. Eliza discovered hidden talents for bread making and quilting, while Colton revealed a passion for reading aloud in the evenings, his deep voice bringing characters to life beside the crackling fire. When blizzards isolated them for days, they found contentment in each other's company, strengthening the bond that had begun in crisis but grown in calm, everyday moments. Eliza taught Colton to dance in their kitchen, and he showed her how to play poker, using beans as betting chips and stealing kisses as forfeit for lost hands. Spring brought renewal in more ways than one. As the snow melted and wildflowers once again dotted the meadows around their home, Eliza confirmed what she had suspected for weeks: they would welcome a child before the year's end. Colton's joy at the news was boundless. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around their sunlit kitchen before setting her down with sudden concern. Was that too rough? Should you be resting more? What does the doctor say? Eliza laughed, placing her hands on his chest to calm him. The doctor says I'm perfectly healthy and so is our baby. And no, I shouldn't be resting more. Moderate activity is good for both of us. Still, he insisted, you'll take it easy with the school, won't you? Maybe cut back your days. I'll teach until I can't fit behind the desk anymore, she replied firmly. But I've already spoken with Aunt Helen about taking over when the time comes. Their son, Samuel James Kincaid, was born on a crisp October evening with Helen and the town doctor in attendance. Colton paced the front porch throughout Eliza's labor, wearing a path in the wooden boards until Helen finally called him inside to meet his son. The sight of Eliza, tired but radiant, holding their swaddled infant, brought the strong cowboy to his knees beside the bed. He's perfect, Colton whispered, gently touching the baby's downy head. Just like his mother, Eliza smiled, making room for him to sit beside her. I was thinking of your father for his middle name. You don't speak of him often, but I know how much he meant to you. Emotion tightened Colton's throat. James would have been honored, he managed, and amazed to see how far his son had come. As Samuel grew, so did the ranch and the family's happiness. Eliza returned to teaching part-time when their son was 6 months old, bringing him with her to the schoolhouse 3 days a week. The children adored baby Sam and took turns holding him while Eliza conducted lessons. By their 3rd anniversary, the Kincaid Ranch had expanded to include 500 acres, 60 horses, and a small herd of cattle. Colton hired 2 full-time hands and built a bunkhouse for them near the corrals. The success allowed them to make improvements to the main house, including indoor plumbing that Eliza declared worth every penny and more. Their daughter, Catherine Helen, arrived the following spring, completing their family. With 2 healthy children and a thriving ranch, Eliza sometimes marveled at how different her life had become from what she had imagined that day on the wagon train. Any regrets? Colton asked one evening as they sat on their expanded front porch, watching 5-year-old Sam and 2-year-old Catherine chase fireflies in the twilight. He still asked the question occasionally, as if part of him couldn't believe his good fortune. Only that I didn't come west sooner, Eliza replied, leaning against his shoulder. She reached for his right hand, tracing the faded scars that remained from the burning wagon. Everything that matters to me is here, even when winter comes and the snow piles higher than the fence posts. He teased, especially then, she answered with a smile. That's when I have you all to myself. Colton pressed a kiss to her temple. Who would have thought that a burning wagon would lead to all this? I would, said Eliza confidently. The moment you appeared through those flames, I knew my life had changed forever. I just didn't know how completely wonderful that change would be. As darkness settled over the ranch and they called the children in for bedtime, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had left St. Louis seeking merely security and purpose had found so much more love, family, and a strength within herself she never knew existed. And it had all begun with a cowboy brave enough to ride through flames, and a schoolteacher courageous enough to build a new life from the ashes.